Let me welcome you all to this very, I hope, very interesting session with Father Friedrich Bechina. My name is Sister Helen Alford. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'm glad to see many of our students here today. I would like to hand over to our rector, Father Thomas Joseph White, who will give a little welcome to our distinguished guest. Thank you very much, Father.
I don't believe my task is to give a formal introduction, although I will make some introductory remarks about our speaker, but I do wish to speak personally about Father Bechina, his contribution to ecclesial life, and also why I think it's so important that the topic he's treating be treated here and be considered more broadly in the church, and I'll be brief about that. Father Bechina is Austrian and has worked for many years in the Dicastery for Culture and Education, I believe 17 years, and is out of a profile in religious life of a community, the work, which I believe is of Belgian origin, and which serves to, among other things, propagate and study the life and writings of John Henry Newman, who, as we know, also was an exemplary exponent of the importance of Catholic education, not most famous for his book, The Idea of a University, but among other things, extremely famous for that work, which is, to this day, one of the most important books of analysis of what a university is and what it's for. And it's symbolically important that the Holy See has, relied on the work of Father Bechina over the years to promote university and secondary education life in the service of the Church in the spirit of John Henry Newman. The Church has frontiers in education as well as fundamental prerogatives. The fundamental prerogatives is to educate people in the basic sacred sciences, philosophy and theology, ecclesiastical history and canon law, Catholic social doctrine, but also to see the interconnection between those topics and other fundamental forms of humanistic education, scientific learning, mathematical and socio-empirical competence. But the Church also has horizons, and we often, I think, are so habituated to what we might call the common questions and problems that emerge, we don't always see those horizons. I think about today, I was talking to the rector of another university today, and we were just thinking about the fact that here in Rome, we've rightly thought for 100 to 150 years about the Church's engagement with secularism, with the problem of religious identity in European and North American culture, with the engagement with biblical critical studies and historical sources of learning. But have we thought sufficiently about the subcontinent of India, where you have, I think, probably today the fourth largest economy in the world, one of the top 8 economies in the world for sure, the largest population, a huge Catholic Church, and a world religious tradition that goes largely unexamined in Rome. And I say that not to denigrate our limitations of learning, but just to think about horizons, about what it means to think afield, abroad, for the next generation about the missionary and educational imperatives of the life of the Church and how we engage with traditions and culture. So I think having Father Bechina speak to us about education and the Church's life of education is precious. It's symbolic for what he's done for the Church, for what he continues to do. And it's also an invitation to us to think about our mission as a university in the service of the Church in the heart of Rome and at the service of the Church for the whole of human culture. So thank you for being here, and thank you for Sister Helen for organizing this, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much, Father Thomas Joseph. So as you will have seen from the posters that you will have looked at, we will have first of all lecture from Father Bechina, and then we have 3 very distinguished respondents. Professor James Arthur, who is visiting us this semester in the Faculty of Philosophy, is a big expert on education himself. Then Father Alejandro Crosthwaite, who is our professor of Catholic social teaching in the Faculty of Social Sciences, and then Professor Giuseppe Casale, who is our professor of history of political thought, and several other courses to do with political issues in the faculty. Then we'll have a chance for Father Bechina to respond, and then we'll have about half an hour, we hope, for general discussion. And then we'll take a little drink at the end, and we'll have some further discussion between us. So I'm very happy now to hand over to Father Bechina.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Rector Magnificus and Sister Helen and all the others for this kind invitation to speak about something which is part of my life. Education became about 20 years ago a greater part of my life, and having been able to serve under 3 different popes who were all very strong in education, but from very different backgrounds and very different approaches to education. And in the middle of the 3 ones, beginning with John Paul II and ending now with the present Pope, where I finished my service last year with Pope Francis. And in the middle of this, in the longest time, was Pope Benedict, who himself is an academic and who very much was interested in the question of education, higher education. And when I was working there, we did a lot of documents in the congregation at that time, always departing from theological, philosophical principles. But I experienced also traveling around the world, seeing our schools, that very often the critical questions are not so much the question of which kind of pedagogy. That's very important, and we should have a clear identification on this. But the critical questions typically were the ones concerning the relationship between church and state, the relationship between faith and reason, and all these big questions which are, in the best case, in discussion, and in the worst case, the reason for why discussion does not function, and I come probably back to this question later on. The topic which I have chosen is a bit misleading, because I say education, the only useful contribution of the church to modern society, and you will now think that I will give a great apology on Catholic education and demonstrate that the church is needed in the world because it's the best and most important global educator. But there is people who are more qualified to speak about education than myself. I use education as my point where I came from, but want to focus rather on the questions which are the underlying ones, if I may say it like this. So education, the only useful contribution of the church to modern society. Sometimes people are happy about this, and sometimes people accuse us and say, should the church adapt to what people expect from it? Should the church play a certain role which probably is not the exact role of the church? Is it good to speak about a useful church? Should we be useful? Or is there the tendency, if we are useful, that we lose our own identity? And the contribution of the Catholic Church and her institution to education on a global scale is impressive. You have read it probably in the introduction. We speak about 220,000 Catholic schools with an enrollment of 70 million students at the moment. And there is nearly no country in the world where there is not something in Catholic education. And that means we are definitely the only real global player in education. Obviously, India, just quoted, they have far more schools than the Holy See has schools, or the Catholic Church has schools, but they are mainly in India, and we have them everywhere. And then it is not just the numeric importance of Catholic schools, but also the groups for whom they are caring, often groups which would not get the best education which they deserve, which they need. And this can be discriminated groups as well as elites. And it's also interesting that the church, in her long history, both has cared for the education for the future leaders, as well for the education for those who have special needs or who would not have education without the institutions of the church. So purpose, structure, and limits of this presentation. I will mainly focus on numbers in Caritas in Veritate, actually 53 to 56, where I think in a very exemplar way Pope Benedict addresses the big questions of modernity. We'll come back to them, what he himself says, which they are. And I believe he is right in his analysis, at least in my field in education. These were really the big questions. And we want to look a bit together on these texts and see what we can learn, because I think these are texts which have not yet used to the fullness of their possibilities. And therefore I will structure my presentation in three major parts. First is Pope Benedict's political agenda. We shall see that this was set out in his Christmas greetings to the Roman Curia 2005. It's also an interesting place to do this. But if you go through this document, then you really see, and you compare this with the later pontificate, you will see that he exactly said what was his big topics which he again and again addressed, especially in the meetings on his journeys when he was meeting with universities or people in the public sphere, but also in his three major encyclical letters. And that brings us to the core of the presentation, which is the question of the church in the modern world, according to Caritas in Veritate 53 to 56. And it's kind of exegesis, a reading together. And then I want to do some conclusions which are not answers, but should open the floor for the further discussions. And the limits of this presentation is that this is not a tract in the full sense. It is not a lecture, and especially not a lectio magistralis. I feel honored by the wording, but it's a simple contribution which wants rather to ask you, who are the academics, to continue to think about these questions, to use what we have an enormous richness of material here, and to help the church what the role of theology is, to do what I would call, with quoting Stephen Bullivant, cultural apologetics, which is to have an argument that our faith is true and has to say something which is not just useful, but I would even say important or necessary for our society. So Pope Benedict's political agenda, and he set it out, at least from my understanding, in his address to the Roman Curia, Christmas greetings, 22nd December 2005. Remember, 3 days later, his first encyclical letter was published, Deus Caritas. But Deus Caritas is a wonderful theological tract, but it is not the political program. There is parts of it, but in the speech, and you find in the speech where he addresses the Curia. No, probably not big surprise, somebody who has worked himself so many years for the Curia and wanted to tell the Curia what his big issues are. And he did it in a way which is again surprising, but not surprising if you know the personality of Pope Benedict. So it's in his very modest, very gentle way within the Christmas greetings, and then even remembering the Second Vatican Council. And he say, we just remember that it's 40 years ago that the closure of the Second Vatican Council, but then he comes back to the big questions, and the big questions, they come back then in his pontificate, and we will see what these questions are. And it's also interesting that in this way how he set out these topics, he does it in a certain modest way, and then if you look at the discussions, this speech is always quoted for the hermeneutics of the Second Vatican Council, the question between reform and rupture, reform and continuity. But I believe, and this we can see, that especially the second part, which is half of the speech, which is on the question of modernity and the big questions of modernity, and this I would say was his political program, political agenda for his pontificate. So what, if we want to focus down what this means, this political agenda, so I put 3 principles which he presents in this speech, but also are his political agenda, if you want. It's first an authentic interpretation and implementation of the Second Vatican Council according to a hermeneutic of reform, of renewal in the continuity of the one subject church which the Lord has given to us. Verses 1, so a hermeneutic that I would call, that's quoting Benedict, a hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture. I don't want to go now into this theological discussion. The second is to determine in a new way the relationship between the church and the modern era. He says this was one of the big achievements of the Second Vatican Council, which has not yet received to its full and should be further developed. And therefore, again quoting Stephen Bullivant, he develops what I would call, or with Bullivant, a cultural apologetics, in order to relaunch, strengthen, and promote the missionary appeal of an outgoing church. He wants to defend, and that's apologetic in the sense like the early martyrs, like the early fathers did, to give the argument that our faith has something to say in our time, and has something to say to every and each culture in this world. That's what we believe, and that's what he wants again to announce, also to make the church, what then came again in the political agenda of Pope Francis with his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium. But the idea is there, with this kind of going back to the roots and presenting the faith, which was also the goal of the Second Vatican Council, presenting the faith in a way that it is acceptable for man in the modern era. So if we go to determine in a new way the relationship between the church and the modern era, and this is a quote from the Christmas speech, it might be said that the 3 cycles of questions had formed, which then, at the time of the Second Vatican Council, were expecting an answer. And these are these 3 big questions of the modern time. The big questions which then were the key questions, according to my experience, of the pontificate of Pope Benedict. The first one, the relationship between faith and modern science had to be redefined. That was the idea of the Vatican Council. We remember it starts with Galileo, and there is this clash of attitudes which somehow came because they were thinking, that's a theory, they were thinking too similarly and getting into conflict and competition with each other. Probably because science sometimes transgressed their limits, and affirmations based on faith on the other side did the same, and so it came to a certain clash of opinions, of ideologies to a certain extent. The second question is the definition of the relationship, again relationship, that's a key word, we will come back to this again, between the church and the modern state that would make room impartially for citizens of various religions and ideologies, merely assuming responsibility for an orderly and tolerant coexistence among them, and for the freedom to practice their own religion. That's interesting. The church historians at the moment are very much studying in the archives the relationship between the Holy See and the United States, so in their development. And it's interesting because in a time when in Rome, in pontifical institutions, they would still have taught something as divine law, some political opinions, and theologians presented them if they were divine law. At the same time, in the relationship with the United States, the Holy See already began to develop other attitudes, and it's one of the points which Pope Benedict points out elsewhere, is that there is still a coherence, because he said in a certain way all the attempts were referring to the biblical words that you should give to Caesar what Caesar's is and to give to God what God's is, but there was and is still a struggle and will be always a struggle how to define this. But this is interesting also from our point of view, not to forget that there is a historical development in this question, and that this development will probably be, or not probably, but will definitely not be at an end. And we don't know how societies will look in 50 and 100 years. Sometimes we may have quite some concerns how they may look, but the church will find an answer. And thirdly, linked more generally to this, was the problem of religious tolerance, a question that required a new definition of the relationship between the Christian faith and the world's religions. And this, again, combined with the two other questions, again, we are speaking relationship, again, and combined especially with the second question, how state should react and should define the relationship between state and religion. Because up to relatively recent times, the church would have defended the doctrine that you have to protect only the true faith, and there's only the only true faith would be the Christian faith. They said state has no reason to protect religions which are not true. At least this was the argument. And this functions as long as you are in the majority. But if you are not in the majority, and if a government believes that you are not the true religion, what do you then argue? And we will see how Pope Benedict argued in this question. And what do I mean with cultural apologetics, the missionary appeal of an outgoing church? And there again a quote, "The martyrs of the early church died for their faith in that God who was revealed in Jesus Christ, and for this very reason they also died for freedom of conscience and the freedom to profess one's own faith, a profession that no state can impose, but which instead can only be claimed with God's grace and freedom of conscience. A missionary church now for proclaiming her known for proclaiming her message to all peoples must necessarily work for the freedom of the faith. She desires to transmit the gift of the truth that exists for one and all." And it's interesting because here Pope Benedict goes back to the early church fathers, and what was this situation to them, similar as the situation of our days, because it was a situation where they were not the majority and where they had to claim the reason, to give the reason for their faith. That's this apology and apologetics. And this is interesting because in this quote you find exactly the values of enlightenment of the modern era. The values of the modern era are there. And Pope Benedict says this is exactly what the martyrs, so the idea that the martyrs died for what was later on defined as human rights is an interesting way to put it, but helps us also to see that human rights is not an invention of more recent times. And this is again Pope Benedict's proof here. He would probably have said that there is not a rupture between, but there is continuity, even if from time to time truths are expressed in different ways. And then White's apologia. In the first letter of St. Peter urged Christians always to be ready to give an answer, apologia, to anyone who asked them for the logos, that's the reason for their faith. And that's then his also typical reference to this spousal between the Hebrew, the biblical culture and the Greek culture, which for him was kind of the start, at least of Christian theology, for him probably even of kind of doctrine. And then we see, and he quotes, I had to put this because that's also the genius of this house here, is in the Dominicans to continue this apologia, and the great heroes of this apologia, like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, were very strong in their time. And we can ask ourselves, how should this be done? And I think we find in this place, quite a lot of this work done also in our days. And for this, I have also to thank you also for what I've experienced through these 20 years working at the congregation and seeing the wonderful intellectual work, not only of the Angelicum, but of the whole order of St. Dominic. That's really impressive. And it's this strong tradition, I think, also of apologia, which our time needs. So that's a tricky issue. If we want to ask ourselves, where is this mindset of Pope Benedict coming from? What are elements? That's not an exhaustive list, but what are elements that made him think like he thought? And I think there is this great appreciation of the intellectual patrimony and traditions. And that's in the broadest sense. He was a man of study, interested in basically everything. So if somebody came and told him about a new invention for something in agriculture, he would, with great eyes, would have listened to him, as well if a Thomist would have come and say, we have a new interpretation for St. Thomas. And these patrimony and traditions, knowing them and taking from these treasures again and again and confronting them with new questions, that's typical for him. And that goes beyond philosophy, beyond theology, goes into literature, goes into arts, in nearly all aspects of life, of public life. A second, not unimportant experience for him was the Second World War and totalitarian regimes. So his strong plea against all kinds of ideology, and not just saying they are bad because this is what they did, but he asked the question, why did they what they did? What kind of thinking was behind? And there is this interesting thing when politics become metaphysical and metaphysics become policies, yeah, politic metaphysical. That's the risk, and there is where ideologies start. He has a typical approach going to deep and fundamental questions. So he would not remain at the surface and say, okay, totalitarian regimes are bad because they took away freedom from people and did a lot of cruelty in their time. But he would go deep to the fundamental questions. What is the basic questions? What is the philosophy behind it? Why did they think and did do what they did? Then you find really a passionate love for faith as well as for reason. So whoever met with Pope Benedict could see his really very, very simple faith and this love for liturgy, the love for religious traditions, the love of the prayers and of the chants of the simple people, which he knew from his early childhood. And when his brother came to visit him, the brother played on the piano and they together sang these old songs together. So this is his love for faith, but as well for reason. And he always tried to keep them together. So he was in love, I think more than with anybody or anything else, with these two, with faith and with reason. And therefore, one could call him a defensor fide et rationis, so not just fide. And it's problematic to give this title to somebody, I understand. And then there is something which people who are not familiar with the German political system would not probably so easily understand. He departs very often his reasoning, especially in the relationship between state and church, from the Congregatorian approach in Germany. So, which means that the two realities should remain in contact and should define who is competent for what, for the common good, because they believe both, church and state, that they serve society, that they serve the people, and they should agree how they can together serve best to them. That's the ideal. And that's, at least theoretically, in a concordat. Concordat means la concordancia, that means that two have the same feelings in their heart. And Cardinal Parolin recently, 2 years ago, in a congress said that far more than the concordat is the concordia important. So the idea of diplomacy of the Holy See, and that is the question of state and church, is to reach this level of concordia, that you agree, and that means also that you agree who is competent for what and who is not competent for what. And both have to learn this, and had to learn this, and negotiate this. And in his speech to the Roman Curia, he said that this will never be without tensions. But that's the way of a concordat. And at the end of any concordat, it say, should there conflicts arise, you have to enter into dialogue and find an anonymous solution to them. That's the principle of a concordat. And then another point, which is a bit typical for Germany, is that in Germany the universities typically have at least one theological faculty, often even more. And I have visited universities, actually this was in Romania, in Cluj, where they have, I think, 4 or 5 theological faculties of different beliefs. But the idea is that the theology is not something for inside the church, but it is something for the public sphere. We have to underline this in Italy, because in Italy this is a big discussion. And as well as the state in Italy does not want theology in their universities, the church doesn't want to have their theology under the control of a state university, or the rector of a state university. Meanwhile, in Germany, there is, again, based on the concordat, this balance which gives theology part and space in the public sphere. And this comes back and again and again when the Pope speaks about the problems of secularism and fundamentalism, because for his understanding, it's the role of theology to counterbalance this, and good theology would prevent religion to fall either into fundamentalism or a state to fall into a secularism which excludes religion from the public sphere. So, now coming to the core of my presentation, which is number 53 to 56 of Caritas in Veritate. But before I go there, let me give another comment. We say the church in the modern world in the dogmatic constitution, but it says the ecclesia in mundo huius temporis, so it does not use the word modern, which is also, I'm not a philosopher, but this is can be a very hot discussion in philosophy, what we mean if we speak with modern, and sometimes we use it because we use it, but it is a concept which is also a bit delicate to use, and probably it was on purpose that the pastoral constitution is reading in mundo huius temporis of this time, because modern can also be a judgment about the quality or the definition of this time. Only to give a short context, we have seen that Pope Benedict is speaking a lot of relations, and relations, or let us put it in another way, communio or unity, all these notions are key notions of the Second Vatican Council, especially when it speaks about the Church. And there is from my understanding, the two fundamental quotations is the one is that the Church is in Christ like a sacrament or a sign and instrument, both of a very closely knit union with God and of the unity of the whole human race. So the reason for the Church to be and the mission of the Church is creating relations with God and creating relations among the sons and daughters of God who have become sons and daughters of God by baptism. That's the concept of Lumen Gentium. And then continues, so that all men joined more closely today by various social, technical, and cultural ties might also attain fuller unity in Christ. And this is the concept of evangelization by Pope Paul VI, who said evangelization is transformation of culture in Christ, transformation of human unity in the unity of the triune God. And this is taken over in Gaudium et Spes 40, where the council plays with the two words, the family of the nations, so that means all people in the world who have this longing for unity, and it's the Church's mission to bring along this unity, to work for this, to promote this unity, but in the end, in view of that all should be renewed in Christ and transformed into God's family. So it's the missionary attitude. But both documents, and I would say this is the key ecclesiological affirmation, it's number 40 of Gaudium et Spes, corresponding perfectly to number 1 of Lumen Gentium, and putting again the mission of the Church in terms of relations, which we want to keep in mind when we now go to Pope Benedict's encyclical Caritas in Veritate, which was the last one. There is one which was kind of posthumous, but not posthumous, but after his pontificate, but where people know that it is not from the style, it is not these big questions. It's more a sectorial thinking, but I don't want to judge about any document. But the big 3 encyclical letters, which all touch these topics, is Caritas in Veritate, going back then Spe Salvi 2007, Deus Caritas in 2005. Just one word on the structure of Caritas in Veritate, all of you would know it. It's one of the social encyclicals. It's in the tradition of the social encyclicals that they would quote their preceding documents or relate to a specific preceding document. So we have the whole tradition of all the jubilees of Rerum Novarum through the centuries. And there is another tradition, which is the one for Populorum Progressio, and this is in the tradition of Populorum Progressio, not so much because of the number of the years, but because of Pope Benedict's thoughts and taking a lot of thinking of Populorum Progressio, but this would lead us far too far. And it has 79 numbers, sections, and it's organized in 6 chapters. Interesting, if you look at the chapters, and I don't want to interpret this in ways which is more important, what is not important, because in the first reactions I remember that many people said, okay, here the language of Benedict stops, that must be somebody else, and some tried even to identify. Sister Helen would probably know who were the people. And then it starts again with Benedict and so on. But it is striking, because you have a very strong theological introduction, and then at every beginning and every end of every chapter, you have again a very either philosophical, theological, but rather fundamental presentation of the argument, and then it goes down into the different applications. And then at the end of the chapter, there is a kind of a conclusion, which also has, again, this theological approach. And then the final conclusion, the last two numbers of the document as well. This you can keep, that helps you also reading this document. And then you have these 6 chapters, and the chapter which we are speaking about here now is the development of people, the cooperation of the human family. So again, there I've put the quote of Gaudium et Spes. So definitely Pope Benedict is thinking about also the continuity and the real interpretation according to him, and the application of the doctrine of the Second Vatican Council. Catholic social doctrine within a hermeneutic of reform, and not one of discontinuity and rupture. The commitment to expressing a specific truth in a new way demands new thinking on this truth and a new and vital relationship with it. So this is hermeneutic of reform, of continuity. It's also clear that new words can only develop if they come from an informed understanding of the truth, expressed, and on the other hand, there's something missing, that a reflection on faith also requires that this faith be lived. So this is what Pope Benedict understands with a hermeneutic of reform. To give you an example, if you look through these texts, and I don't have to read them out, but you can take the time and read them while I'm speaking. This is the way how Pius XI, remembering 40 years of Rerum Novarum in 1931, is presenting Catholic social doctrine. We cannot imagine today somebody speaking in these terms, but it's also reflecting the rhetoric of his time. Because if we listen to political speeches of this time, be it Churchill or other people whom you should not quote in this room here, or not even, but I did once. I had an examination, one on political speeches, and one of the speeches of the wartime in Germany. But it is interesting because you see there is a similar rhetoric in it, which we would not use today. But it's interesting because the content, if you go behind the rhetoric, if you see what the affirmation is, it is not that different from what Benedict, in a very, very different style, would say in Caritas in Veritate. And that's the reason why I recommend to you to read this one, and then the wise pontiff, long wait at all this in his mind before God. He summoned the most experienced, learned counsel, and pondered last. And then 11. It's really dramatic how it is said. But it is said that what it basically says is that the world needs the thinking of religion to function also as in a political sense. So, in these numbers, where is Benedict departing from? So we could say he's departing from the signs of the time, and he wants to identify something where people can agree. And then he starts with forms of poverty and isolation. And that's interesting because this is something which you can also scientifically prove that this is a challenge of our time. All forms of poverty, but also all these forms of isolation. And he links it with the closure of human persons in themselves. And then we remember St. Augustine, who defines sin in that way. That sin means to be focused, closed in yourself. And that's something that you definitely find in this. And that's the next point, again, another point of the signs of the time. And there again, we would probably say our time is crazy. But in his very gentle and polite way, one thing he quotes another one. So he quotes Paul VI and then puts in these nice words, the world is in trouble or is sick, as it is, I think, in the original, because of the lack of thinking. And then you see there is something missing, because man is focused on itself, is isolated, is experiencing forms of poverty, and on the other hand, there is a lack of thinking. And then he says there should be a deeper critical evaluation of the category of relation. That's a key point in this. That's his starting point. A critical evaluation of the category of relations. And then he says, and this is and there the apology begins, this is a task that cannot be undertaken by the social sciences alone, insofar as the contribution of disciplines such as metaphysics and theology is needed if man's transcendent dignity is to be properly understood. And here we are hearing Pope Paul's affirmation that if man loses God, it will lose humanity as well. And then he brings in the metaphysical understanding of the relations between persons is of great benefit for the human development. And there he makes this argument how this interacts between faith and the human development. Now, in 54, he then brings in the topic of the Holy Trinity and say theology can be enlightening for human constitution of human beings, of what real humanity is, taking the image from the Trinity. And that's interesting because here again he brings in the values of enlightenment. So autonomy, reason, all these things, and combines it with the Trinitarian faith, where he says that the unity of the Trinity doesn't take away anything of the unity of the three persons in one God. And then that's one of the most surprising affirmations when he quotes Ephesians 5:31. If one studies the council, sees how this was discussed, that this analogy was used for the church. And we know in the catechesis of John Paul II, this was even taken out when he became too explicit, because that's relating to the sexual union of men and women in marriage, spousal relationship. And the interesting thing is that Pope Benedict here does not just apply this to the church as a whole, but he uses this for arguing how truth and love are in service of unity. And then he says, like this unity of men and women in sexual intercourse, so is kind of an agreement in truth. You have to think about this analogy. I've never seen something anywhere else. And I think this was not, I've also not seen many who have commented on this, but it's quite courageous to argue in that way. The Christian, and then it's the question church-state, church modernity that comes up. The Christian revelation of the unity of the human race presupposes a metaphysical interpretation of the human in which relationality is an essential element. And they say the Christian revelation is there. to underline this. And then he says, other cultures and religions teach brotherhood. So it's a positive affirmation that there is other religions who serve the same purpose. But then there is the long white, and I don't read it now out for you, but here he speaks about all possible shortcomings of religion, which you may find. And say, there is a, this would be the next thought, but you can already feel how he uses the human and the human values and the values of modernity as criteria for demonstrating what the real religion is. And that's an interesting thought, because modernity seems to have been against the Christian religion, and now Benedict turns this around, takes their key values and argues that they are better kept within the faith than without faith. And then this is the key of the question between state and church. For this reason, while, and then be careful, it may, he says, it may be true that development needs the religions and cultures of different peoples. So that means, do we need all religions? Do we need all cultures? Do we need, development needs religions, the religions, culture of differences? It is equally true. It is true that adequate discernment is needed. Religious freedom does not mean religious indifferentism, nor does it imply that all religions are equal. Discernment is needed regarding the contribution of cultures and religions, and then look at that, especially on the part of those who wield political power. What does this mean? Does this mean that the political power is the judge on religions? I would say no, if you read it carefully, but as the function, as the mission of the state is to protect and to provide justice and peace, they should have a look which religion is empowered to foster justice and peace, which brings real unity among people, and which is also on the level of faith and reason. So in the sense that the doctrine corresponds to what is at least understandable, and you can give reason why it makes sense. And then he says Christianity, the religion of the God who has a human face, contains this very criterion within itself. And that means he takes the decision about the right religion away from the state and say, no, it's God to decide. And God has revealed this, and then we come back to the affirmation that there is one true religion. So it's a very sophisticated way to keep this statement, to keep this conviction that there is only one true church in the full sense, but on the other hand, that for the political reason, there must be a discernment on the way how the different religions serve the common good and the purpose of the state. And there he is confident that it is possible to give the proof that's in the sense of apologetics, that the Christian faith is true one. So I should finish. And that's the reason why religion, he speaks about Christian religion and other religions, but with this discernment, should have a place in the public realm. And I say because otherwise you would fall into one or the other extremes. We can come in the discussion to the question what it means if the state takes over competences which are the ones of religion, so becomes metaphysically speaking, politics become metaphysics, or if metaphysics become politics on the side of the church. And I come to the conclusion, Catholic education, a useful contribution of the church in modern society. I would doubt if we should argue in that sense. But I would argue that Catholic schools and education should be a privileged place of encounter between the modern society and the church, between faith and reason, but never without tensions. And it is a fact that Catholic schools, more than any other Catholic institution, is in this tension between state laws and church laws. And this does on both sides, acting on both sides and acting in favor of both systems. Catholic schools and education are a place of permanent reform and continuity. Catholic schools and education promote critical thinking and discernment, which we need also for the discernment about the real religion, which is necessary to be also able to, in freedom, to opt for your own faith. Catholic schools and education are an expression of serving and an outgoing church. And last but not least, Catholic schools and education should be agents in the argument of cultural apologetics. Thank you.
So, thank you, Sister Helen, something for that. But I wasn't going to use this slide, but I thought since Father Bechina kept on talking about Pope Benedict, I wanted to use it to make a point. The context of this was the oratory in Birmingham. It was the day that Pope Benedict beatified John Henry Newman. He'd just done that in a large park. And afterwards, he came back to the Oratory House, where I was invited to join the Oratory Fathers to meet Pope Benedict. I'd just written a book about John Henry Newman as an eminent thinker in education, and I was able to present that to the Pope as well. But what was really remarkable was, which seems to confirm everything that Father Bechina says, Pope Benedict began to start a conversation with me about education. I was introduced as an expert on Catholic education. I'm not sure why, but I was. And he began this conversation with me about Catholic education, about Newman, etc. And I cannot remember what I said. You know, I cannot remember anything about that part of it, sort of thing. I was just amazed by the whole thing. I did respond, but I can't remember what I said. And then afterwards, I thought, okay, well, professors often speak nonsense, so I should be okay getting away with that one. So it wasn't too bad. But he was really interested in education at every level. And that's just amazing. So I had that privilege of meeting him. When he came in, I was at the bottom of the queue, and there was all the provosts of different oratories, and then there was fathers, and then there were some brothers, etc. And he was supposed to start with the top ones, you know, the provosts, etc. But he came straight to me, sort of thing. He saw me by myself, and he came immediately to me. I had to actually stand away from some of the other fathers as well. I was just standing there. So it was a very, very special moment, and he was very interested in education. Now, I want to thank Father Bechina for his speech this evening. Being undersecretary at any congregation is a huge challenge, but at education, with such a vast portfolio, you've heard already that 220,000 educational institutions, and those are just schools. It did not include universities, which was another nearly 1,000 of them as well, and 70 million students. Our contribution to education globally is unprecedented for any organization, totally unprecedented. And our investment in the people who run these institutions is quite remarkable. Father Bechina had oversight of this vast enterprise from his offices here in Rome, but he traveled extensively, keeping in touch with developments on a global basis. We have much to be thankful for his selfless service and dedication to the cause of Catholic education. Now, however, as an academic, I need not venture far into educational, theological, and philosophical discourse about Catholic education to get the sense that often the term is not defined clearly. Remember that we live in an age when the reigning philosophical presuppositions are generally antagonistic to Catholicism. I want to begin by saying that a Catholic educational institution can be open to the world. It can work to preserve its identity, but we must not be naive. Ideologies, attitudes, and behaviors that are incompatible with Catholic education exist. While Father Bechina was Undersecretary, his congregation published an instruction in 2022, just last year, called The Identity of the Catholic School for a Culture of Dialogue. And it opens with the admission that the congregation has been confronted with many cases of conflict and appeals resulting from different interpretations of the traditional concept of Catholic identity by Catholic institutions. The document also acknowledges that there are divergent interpretations of the term Catholic. The instruction generally restates church teaching on Catholic education, but there's also a firm and renewed commitment to Catholic identity. While each Catholic educational institution is to develop its own statement of mission based on church documents and under the oversight of the local bishop, it is stated that any institution that calls itself Catholic should be Catholic. Catholic schools must be endowed with a specific identity centered on Jesus Christ and uphold and teach the truths of the Catholic faith. It states that we cannot create a culture of dialogue if we do not have identity. Now, Catholic institutions are increasingly involved in discussions about what constitutes Catholic identity. The emphasis in the document is for Catholic educational institutions to have clear policies as a way of defending and protecting Catholic identity. An important focus of those proposed recommended regulations in the document concern the employment of teachers who are to uphold Catholic teaching but may experience a growing range of internal rules and protocols which could result in legal challenges. Little is said about any philosophical basis for this identity, which is instead to be secured through better regulation and more explicit policies. The other main theme of the document is dialogue. Dialogue is central to the papacy of Pope Francis and can be understood as witnessing to one's faith, but being open to the religious and non-religious beliefs of others. It is about sharing with others to better understand our similarities and to dispel misconceptions and misunderstandings. Dialogue has its own challenges, since it requires the navigation of various individual perspectives. Such navigation can create discomfort, and in some countries, dialogue is almost impossible. Dialogue with different philosophical positions is also sometimes impossible, as not every philosophical stance is open to dialogue. The question arises of how you can strengthen identity while simultaneously remaining open to diversity and dialogue. Perhaps the most important form of dialogue is between those who share the Catholic faith, because what is urgently needed is a respectful conversation among the different factions within the Catholic community. Catholic education can certainly have a capacity for singularity and multiplicity based on the lived experience of diverse Catholics. The Church does not speak on Catholic education with an unequivocal and unambiguous voice. A plurality of educational positions has surfaced which do not simply differ but often conflict with each other. Even worse, the advocates of these positions align themselves with either the current Pope or his predecessors, causing damage to the unity of the Church. On one side of the debate, we see a focus on the social nature of human beings and less emphasis on Christian revelation or tradition. Tradition is seen as emphasizing differences rather than similarities. It is seen as unecumenical, defensive, divisive, and even mere apologetics. On the traditionalist side, we see an emphasis on the theological basis of Catholic education, and this slant tends to reject an eclectic approach to the philosophy of Catholic education because they claim it's difficult to define and it's forever changing. We certainly need more and better Catholic thinking on education, as Father Bechina has said, but we above all need a more certain philosophy of Catholic education grounded in some sense of coherence. We ought not, I suggest, to Catholicize everything that the Catholic educationalist or philosopher might write or say. Discussion about philosophies of Catholic education have not always been easy or respectful. Using the ship analogy, I see it sometimes like a naval battle. As St. Basil the Great wrote in the aftermath of the Council of Nicaea in 325, "To what shall I liken our present condition? It may be compared, I think, to some naval battle which has arisen out of time-old quarrels and is fought by men who cherish a deadly hate against each other, of long experience in naval warfare and eager for the fight. Basil gives a vivid description of disagreement after the Council of Nicaea, where no consensus was immediately apparent and some issues remained unresolved. Much could be said of different philosophies of Catholic education today that are in constant flux and even to some extent in disarray. There is real disagreement about their future direction. This is one of the challenges that Father Bechina had to face when he was in office. Now, Catholicism is not a sect exclusively concerned about its own members and is therefore always inclusive of others. It seeks and wills the good of all, or as Benedict said, Catholic, the attribute of the Church, reminds us that the Church of Jesus Christ has never been concerned with only one nation or only one culture, but that from the very start it was destined for humanity. Catholic education, therefore, manifests itself differently in each country, taking on different forms in time and place. Therefore, it is recognized that Catholic education cannot be properly understood in the abstract, independent of its actualization in a particular societal context. However, in the end, Catholic educational institutions ought to have an ecclesial mission to evangelize and catechize baptized Catholics through an integral education that furnishes a Catholic identity and formation that, when operationalized, can transform culture by promoting the common good of all. We should also remember that schools and universities are only one group of means by which we receive an education. Catholic education is simply not just concerned with schools and universities, because the wider cultural context, the community, families, churches, voluntary organizations, the media, and even political life all educate. This could be called the broad sense of education, where the narrow sense of education is confined to schools and universities. I would like to raise some provocative questions. Do Catholic educational institutions have a philosophy of education? If not, is it worth rehearsing and reviving? Are they like secular schools and universities, only that they add a little here and cut a little there? Can we adequately articulate what makes Catholic education different? Who could be said to be furthering a Catholic tradition of philosophical thought in education? I believe Catholic education can have a strong identity as a place of catechesis, evangelization, integral education, mission, and Catholic formation, even if these categories are seen by some as contentious and controversial. A variety of partial philosophies of Catholic education have arisen in practice over time, and the question is, what are we to make of this diversity? What criteria is needed to judge between them? I know Father Bechina has consulted hundreds, probably thousands of experts during his time as Undersecretary on Catholic education from all over the globe. But the instruction I mentioned earlier tells us that we are no closer to securing a consensus. The Catholic tradition is rich and varied, but above all, it is a living tradition born of centuries of experience, study, prayer, and rich cultural heritage. This rich tradition of the Catholic Church helps us to learn and reappropriate it for the purposes of identifying the essential characteristics of Catholic education. Any diversity of philosophies of Catholic education must be commensurable with Catholic teaching and practice. Reddin and Ryan, two academics working out of a Jesuit university in New York, began their major work of Catholic philosophy of education by observing that modern educational thought and practice are characterized by confusion and by bewilderment. More than 80 years later, many would agree that this statement still stands, as we witness a striking diversity of views by Catholics on education. Forming lives of faith, hope, and love in the light of Jesus Christ is therefore part of the evangelizing mission of the Catholic Church and must be understood in terms of and in line with that mission. The main goal of education is therefore to help human beings become beings fully realize their nature as rational and spiritual beings premised on a theistic philosophy of education. Catholic education ought to prepare human beings for life. And the main goal of education is to help us become full human persons. The educational process behind this formation becomes a practical expression of one's theological commitments as a Christian and will influence how we think, believe, learn, act, and treat each other. Catholic education aims to foster the highest degree of excellence in those who receive it, and it can draw on some of the best elements of secular approaches to educational philosophy, but it needs always to venture beyond them. Pope Francis has confirmed that Catholic education is evangelization. He told the Christian brothers in May last year to evangelize by education and educate by evangelization. He concluded his remarks with, "It is your way of realizing what St. Paul wrote, Christ is formed in you. To educate in this way is your apostolate, your specific contribution to evangelization. To make the person grow according to Christ. In this sense, your schools are Christian, not because of an external label, but because they take this path. Thank you for what you are and what you do. Go forth with the joy of evangelizing by educating and of educating by evangelizing." In summary, we should remember that the Church's distinctive call is not a generic invitation to human fellowship, but is a specific call that's addressed to everyone. Meet Jesus and welcome his gospel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Bechina. Thank you very much, James. The presentation was kind of very Germanic by a German professor and also presenting a German pope. So quite the world of ideas. And I think I'm more from the Anglo-American tradition, which is more practical in all the questions. Sorry? So there? Okay. So I come more from an Anglo-American tradition, so more practical and so on. So kind of on the same line as James, and for me it's more practical questions. And so, for example, just as James mentioned in the question, as you start your presentation, of the statistics of the number of schools throughout the world and universities, etc. But we always have to remember, as James pointed out, but also as you pointed out with Pope Benedict, that quantity does not mean quality. And so we do have a lot of Catholic institutions throughout the world. But again, the question, are they Catholic institutions? Just for an example, a couple of years ago, we talked in the United States about the U.S. Catholic Ivy League, and that in 1962, it incorporated universities like Georgetown University, the University of Notre Dame, and Boston College. Now, we only say that is basically University of Notre Dame and Boston College. And yet one of the greatest educators in the United States is the University of Georgetown. But they were taken off from the Catholic Ivy League precisely because of canonical issues and also of not really representing the Catholic voice. And this is of great concern to me because, for example, I who work with the diplomatic corps here in Rome, especially with the American embassy, most of the people there have been educated at Georgetown. But I would very highly question how much of a Catholic worldview do they have. And I'm talking only non-Catholics, but also Catholic members of the American embassy. And that's just one example because I can mention the British embassy, which I work also very closely with, and the Australian embassy. But that's a question, and they all study in Catholic universities. But how much of a Catholic education are they receiving? So that would be one question. The other question, again, is the question of diversity in Catholic schools, and this is where the Latino comes from. And this is, we educate in the world. Most of the schools are now in India, as you mentioned. But who are we educating? Most Catholic schools in the developing world only educate the elite. Only the elite can afford Catholic education. In Mexico, basically all Catholic schools are private institutions with very high tuition that only the upper class and maybe middle upper class can attend. There's some religious orders. I studied under the Mayor's Fathers, and so we were in an elite school, but they did have a school for the poor, which our own tuition paid for the poor to study in the school. But that's an exception, a real exception. We do have some scholarships that they can go to university, but in general, especially in the developing world, it's only educating an elite, and we're not reaching the people themselves. How much does that reflect Christ's own ministry to the poor and the marginalized? In the United States, we were lucky enough that because of the Protestant circumstances and so on, we created the parochial school, which the schools were attached to parishes. Therefore, it educated the migrants, the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, in that level. But we also are losing that. Now most parochial schools are closing because we cannot afford them. And so again, even in the United States, where we had a huge tradition of serving the poor, serving the migrants, we're losing that. And they're becoming private elite schools. So talking about the diversity of the school, are we really reaching the people that Jesus would have reached? Very frightening in India, because in India, it is only the elite we're really training there. Only the elite have studied there. And so that's, a big question. And so the other question that comes with that, too, is the question of dialogue with modern society. So as we know, with the modern world, all critical discussion of issues in the politics, economics, culture, etc., now revolve outside of religion. So the modern world believes we can solve problems without religion. And that's what Pope Francis and Pope Benedict is really trying to say we can. We need religion in the dialogue. But how do we communicate this in a world where the religious voice, if accepted, is simply one more voice? It has no more authority than any secular ideology or any secular idea. And I'm not just talking in the public forum or public forum. Within Catholic universities, Catholic schools themselves, as much as the brothers or sisters try to educate in a Catholic voice, many times it is simply one more voice from what the students get, even if they're Catholic. So it's not that teaching. Theology is no longer the queen of the sciences. So this becomes a problem not only in the secular world, but even within the Catholic world, where it's simply one more voice. So how do we overcome that? And then you also mentioned at the very beginning of your presentation the question of finances and how a lot of schools are struggling financially. And again, big universities, Georgetown, one of them because I know it, is that because of finances, they align themselves to certain monies and therefore respond to whatever the people giving the money, whatever ideology they have, they respond to that to be able to get to the money. Even pontifical universities fall on the same problem, that we do what foundations are asking for us to receive the money. And so sometimes they don't necessarily go with what the Catholic identity of the institution is. So there's all this, as James mentioned, all this kind of practical thing. So yeah, the vision of Benedict is wonderful, and that's what we want to support. But how do we actually do this in this kind of reality that we're living in today? I think positively, of course, we're doing it here at the Angelicum, hopefully, and it is possible. And I know a lot of institutions are trying to do this, but this is the reality. And especially my concern, as you just mentioned, was the most number of schools are in India, where most of the students are not even Christian. So what impact do we really have? Are we just giving them a great professional education, something to maintain themselves in the elite? Or is it really a call to conversion? So, thank you.
Grazie. Tra il teoretico tedesco, germanico e il pratico statunitense, io da italiano mi colloco in una linea mediana, non compromissoria, ma mediana. Sì, io la ringrazio per le ricchissime suggestioni e io, seguendo la traccia del suo intervento, così come preannunciato, vorrei mettere alcuni accenti, non porre questioni o domande, ma alcuni accenti. partendo appunto da un esercizio che secondo me è molto interessante, che è quello di individuare quelle parole, quei concetti paradigmatici che, tolti i quali una età, un mondo, un'epoca, una civiltà non si comprendono. No? Pensiamo, non so, se togliamo la parola mercato, no? Alla nostra epoca, il nostro mondo sembra incomprensibile. O se togliamo all'ambito politico moderno, della politica secolarizzata, il concetto di derivazione teologica, di sovranità, non si capisce cosa sia lo Stato. E secondo me vale lo stesso ragionamento se togliamo alla nostra epoca una delle parole presenti nei passi che ha riportato della Caritas in Veritate, cioè isolamento. No? Isolamento inteso anche come separazione, no? Come diaballein, cioè quelle separazioni secolarizzate che poi sono anche implicate nel paradosso di Buchenforde, che ritorna nel sottotesto dell'enciclica e di quello che lei ci ha detto. E la Caritas in Veritate ci parla di solitudine, no? Come una condizione esistenziale, ma la connette a un rifiuto della dignità trascendente della persona, no? Della relazione orizzontale che viene garantita con la relazione con il fondamento trascendente, che è un po' quel rifiuto che genera oggi, a me sembra, no? Dei vuoti di senso che vengono riempiti da una di quelle religioni secolari o quelle religioni anche politiche che promettono delle felicità escatologica, no? Con dei palliativi, ma che riguardano essenzialmente la dimensione privata dell'esistenza, no? O delle gratificazioni psicologiche. E quindi questo a me pare coinvolgere pesantemente la sfera pubblica. Non si tratta soltanto di una solitudine consumata all'interno della dimensione privata dell'individuo, ma è una solitudine che viene esercitata a partire da un isolamento, una separazione. Il che a me sembra curioso parlare di isolamento e di separazione in un'epoca in cui invece il termine globalizzazione e soprattutto interdipendenza sembra essere particolarmente caratterizzante. Ma su queste premesse, se queste sono le premesse, cioè le premesse di un rifiuto che isola dal fondamento, o comunque dal dialogo con il fondamento, di quelli che noi chiamiamo essere i diritti della persona, a me sembra parlare la interdipendenza di cui tanto, no, si fa parola, sembra parlare di una unità ma al ribasso, no? Cioè basata su elementi effimeri. E questo oggi lo vediamo sul tramonto di quella che è stata l'euforia neoliberale alla fine degli anni 90, no? Che è quasi un esito maturo del paradosso appunto di Buchenforde, no? Enunciato nel 67 a proposito della crisi di razionalità, Caritas in Veritate, la crisi di razionalità di una civiltà liberale che promette dei risultati, una felicità, basandola su premesse che non vuole o non può garantire, su delle premesse morali. E secondo me per due motivi. Uno, lo dice lo stesso Buchenforde, per il rifiuto, quasi il timore sacro di fare riferimento all'etica, per non tornare nell'incubo dello Stato etico che richiama lo Stato totalitario. Però nel paradosso è proprio il momento etico che dà fondamento, no, a quelle promesse. E poi, secondo me, oggi, contestualizzando nel presente, perché ritengo che ci sia il rifiuto di una concezione sostantiva di diritto naturale, anche un po' furba, cioè un rifiuto furbo, perché permette una certa elasticità, no? Anche una certa spregiudicatezza per giudicare con il doppio standard quando ci sono e quando non ci sono i diritti umani da preservare. E i diritti umani diventano una leva tattica per affermare egemonie o per rivendicare eccezionalismi, no? Supra legem. E anche, nel paradosso ulteriore, per alimentare delle divisioni manichee che sono fortemente invece eticizzanti, per cui il bene contro il male. disegnandola a seconda però, oggi lo vediamo con una certa convulsione anche trasformativa, a seconda dei momenti, io studicchio politica, quindi a seconda dei momenti politici o geopolitici che dir si voglia, per dare spazio a scontri di civiltà, nuove teologie politiche, un po', ma questo non è un qualcosa che ci è piombato sulla testa oggi. Ne parlava Benedetto XVI, ne parlava Buchenforde. Negli anni 40, sul finire degli anni 40, ne parlava il teologo Niebuhr, no? Agostiniano, negli Stati Uniti. Oggi ce ne parla un'ulteriore riprova, non so, quell'isolamento, per tornare alla parola sottratta al nostro tempo, dal diritto naturale, che ci autorizza agli usi extra legem, parliamo di politica internazionale, gli usi extra legem dell'R2P, della responsabilità di proteggere, no? E del suo impiego o della sua evidenza intermittente a seconda dei momenti. Questo secondo me, in dialogo con lei e con la Caritas in Veritate, forse può spiegare un pochettino, non dico in maniera esaustiva, anche il motivo per cui certi fari del pensiero liberale contemporaneo hanno espresso l'incompatibilità del personalismo cristiano, segnatamente cattolico, no? Con i doveri securitari dello Stato liberale. Penso a Rawls, no? Che recupera da Walser la dottrina della Supreme Emergency, no? Per giustificare il sacrificio degli innocenti a difesa preventiva di una società libera, no? Basando su che cosa? La verità di questa promessa eudemonica, di questa felicità? Sul consenso maggioritario che convalida la creazione dal nulla dei diritti della persona, che così come sono creati possono essere abrogati e possono essere manipolati dallo stesso Stato creatore, che poi giudica delle religioni a seconda della loro compatibilità con i suoi canoni ordinamentali. Lo diceva anche Giovanni Paolo II, una democrazia avaloriale non rischia meno di un altro tipo di regime di intraprendere delle strade incompatibili, no? Con il bene della persona. Questo rifiuto a me sembra molto giustificare quell'immagine che Joseph Ratzinger in Introduzione al Cristianesimo richiama, io credo non so, lei lo saprà sicuramente più di me, da una tradizione popolare bavarese, il barone di Münchhausen, quello che pretendeva di tirarsi fuori dalle sabbie mobili tirandosi per i capelli, no? Si sa che tirandosi senza poter far leva su un fondamento solido resta abbastanza difficile. Che in una maniera molto icastica e plastica, no? A me richiama molto quei segnali di allarme che diversi filosofi e filosofi politici in passato di diverse estrazioni hanno proposto e sottoposto alla nostra attenzione. Non so, i francofortesi, no? La scuola di Francoforte, quando parlano dell'uomo a una dimensione, quando parlano della ragione strumentale, mercificante. Michel Foucault, che parla di controllo biopolitico delle esistenze. Voegelin, Strauss, che parlano del compimento dello stato hobbesiano, no? Che riduce l'esistenza umana al mero dato quantitativo. Per fare cosa? Il Leviatano? Per sopprimere quelle eccedenze di senso che danno anche la facoltà di pensare a un qualcosa di diverso da un presente insufficiente. Già il fatto solo di pensare che qualcosa sia migliorabile segnala che c'è qualcosa d'altro su cui fondarlo, no? Dà il sospetto del totalmente altro, quantomeno, no? Ma al tempo stesso segna, in quanto eccedenza, è la funzione dell'educazione cristiana, dell'insegnamento cristiano, in quanto eccedenza segna anche il limite del potere dell'uomo sull'uomo, cioè il limite che ci fa resistere alla tentazione di realizzare il migliore dei mondi possibili, travolgendo tutto ciò che si oppone perché è incompatibile a questo perfettismo. Mi avvio alla conclusione, ma a me i richiami al momento educativo presenti nella Caritas in Veritate hanno fatto ricordare per l'ennesima volta anche i richiami pastorali della Pacem in Terris, che suggeriscono appunto la necessità per rispondere alle sfide contemporanee, sì, di competenza scientifica, capacità, esperienza, ma segnalano anche che una dotazione del genere, se non è condita da un desiderio morale di giustizia e di verità e di unità, restano lettera morta. Per questo io credo che sia fondamentale un momento educativo che educhi anche al pensiero critico, no? Lei parlava prima di illuminismo, di richiami a tecnologie illuministiche, ma cosa c'è di più illuministico che contestare le imperfezioni della realtà, no? Per fondarle su un qualcosa di totalmente altro, senza essere utopisti chiaramente. È un pensiero critico che perfora, no, gli alibi, che denuncia le mistificazioni propagandistiche, che denuncia le ingiustizie, chiunque ne sia vittima. E allora chiudo giocando ancora con la sottrazione dei concetti. Ma la Chiesa è pensabile togliendo la parola educazione? Cioè, io vedo due rischi, però è chiaramente un impressionismo il mio. Un rischio è quello, diciamo, di un isolamento verso l'esterno, ma anche un isolamento interno, cioè un isolamento verso l'esterno in termini di autoreferenzialità, cioè un'educazione autarchica, clericale, domestica, fatta per quelli che sono di casa, diciamo così, e conservare delle rendite di posizione, diciamo così. E il secondo rischio invece è un isolamento interno, cioè mi riferisco a tutte quelle agenzie educative, le università, le scuole, cattoliche e pontificie, che, ripeto, è un impressionismo, a volte possono rischiare però di, anziché raccordarsi per avanzare delle proposte coerenti, rincorrono un po' le mode del momento o anche i dogmi del mondo secolarizzato, quello che pretende di non avere fondamento, no? E poi magari anche marginalizzare, io parlo delle grandi con le piccole, no? Le grandi con le sorelline, le grandi università cattoliche, per quanto riguarda l'ambiente appunto cristiano, cattolico, nazionale, italiano, e le piccoline ma eccellenti come l'Angelicum, le pontificie, no? Salvo poi ricordarsi, invece che di fare quadrato, di ricorrere allo sponsor ecclesiastico quando fa comodo, mi riferisco alle cattoliche, no? E quindi lasciarle un po' in una marginalità che chiaramente viene aggravata anche dal lancio di quegli slogan che servono un po', no? Per accattivarsi la simpatia di quel cosiddetto mondo che pretende di non avere fondamento, no? Come diciamo, allestimenti di una vetrina. Però io vorrei ricordare che in un mercato indifferenziato vale sempre il principio per cui diventa attraente una proposta che si differenzia. Perché omologarsi appunto alle offerte di un mercato indifferenziato poi rischia anche il parvenu di non entrare proprio, perché entra in competizione con qualcuno di più esperto, di più radicato, è il suo tipo di mercato indifferenziato. Quindi il parvenu magari per concorrere dovrebbe investire su una proposta differenziata piuttosto che appiattirsi e essere una voce tra le tante, ma comunque un ritornello dove non si distinguono le provenienze, no, di queste voci. Per esempio, ecco, ho letto per quanto riguarda la sua esperienza, l'adesione, no, al processo di Bologna è un qualcosa sostanziale, un'adesione sostanziale al processo di Bologna è un qualcosa su cui forse ancora riflettere, no, per rilanciare strategicamente la missione, cioè anche per fare della didattica e della ricerca veramente una vocazione, no? Una espressione di carità intellettuale, no? Una forma di evangelizzazione delle coscienze e delle menti. Magari cominciando nell'ambiente sociale o nazionale in cui si è collocati, no? Perché non si può pensare di essere delle isole o delle succursali, no? Prescindendo da tutto ciò che ci sta immediatamente vicino. Il Vangelo dice la messe è grande. Vorrei chiedere e sperare che ci sia anche la volontà di mettere in condizione gli operai di operare in questa messa. Grazie.
Thank you. That was so much and so wonderful. Thank you. Really, all three of you, it was my fault you didn't have a text in time, but you could, and all of you found a weak point where it's worthwhile to think about. And that's fascinating. And I would fully agree, only taking one or the other idea among these many suggestions which you made and contributions which you and added and comments. The question of philosophy of Catholic education. Yeah, that's true. And you could see and going around and seeing people, you can nearly always say it's missing. But if you look deeper, then you say sometimes it's there, but people have never thought about. And this has then to do often with your question. For example, through centuries, if you had enough religious from a certain charism, it was taken for granted they live their charism, they do what they do in their charism. So you never had to think about what means educating within this charism. And this is an answer, I think, to all of you three, because all of you three found out weak points where there's a lot to do and where we somehow feel either paralyzed or not with adequate means, or how should we respond to all these challenges with what we can. And the poorest of the poor, like Mother Teresa always said, my impression in the field of education, Catholic education, the poorest of the poor was Rome, because you can try what you want, but you cannot steer a system of 220,000 plus institutions. But here begins another part of the story, and you could interpret this as a very easy answer now from my side, switching in the theological field and saying now, okay, like John John the 23rd was said that before going to bed, he said, "Good Lord, it's your church, so please take care of you. It's too much for me," or something similar. But the fact that these also shortcomings, that these challenges are seen and are discussed is a good sign, that I would say. And this you can link to the prophetic mission in the church, that you always have people who stand up and say it and come up with ideas. And this is one part of the vitality, and this, I believe, is a strong part in the church. And this I have seen, that neither the Holy Spirit is lacking in any of the institutions which I have seen, and I have been a lot in Georgetown as well, as you mentioned them, nor are people inspired by the Holy Spirit, and I would count what you have said among this, are lacking, who sometimes even take their own initiative, and then something can be happening which Rome definitely did not even imagine, was not even able to put in a document on Catholic identity of schools, like charisms that are founded, like trends that come up, like new educational philosophies that are there, even without that somebody had formally developed them. And then sometimes it's looking to what's going on in different schools, in different fields. You find out that there is something, and then you try to. So it's both. You have those inspired, those which I would call prophetic mission, who go ahead, denounce what is not okay, and offer solutions, and then you have certain things that develop on the bottom, and you can only looking back and say, oh goodness, there is really something nice going on. I don't want to extend anymore, because it would be so nice to continue, and I hope we may find a way, because every single word you gave was really charming. One thing I have to say, and this was my experience working in Rome, when I started, I was quite quick with judgments. So I saw a situation, and then I made a note for my superiors, even sometimes for the Pope, and said, it is like that. And when I finished my work 20 years later, I was very careful with such judgments, because I have seen always even the contrary, which from what I had thought. And I met once a Persian woman who became Catholic because of Georgetown, because she studied there, and she's such a devout Catholic with a beautiful family, everything. And you say, okay, probably it's not in the, you would expect in the mission statement probably something more explicit, but I guess it is still a Catholic university. Like, there is not one Catholic school where I have not found something, a person, sometimes it's the building, a tradition, sometimes it's the students, which demonstrated that it is a Catholic school. And one point which I have to say, you are right that in certain countries there is this, and Latin America definitely is one of them, or it's a region where we are typically caring more for those who can financially afford it. And that makes it so difficult to bring Latino kids in Catholic schools, because their parents always believe, even if they can get it for free or what, they don't send them to Catholic schools because they believe they cannot send them to Catholic schools. So it's also a bit of imagination, or what I would call it. But in other countries, especially in those where we also get public money, that's sometimes the... But fully agree with everything you say. There is mysterium iniquitatis, so sin in all levels and in structures you will find, but that's not the end of the story. There's also something like forgiveness, salvation, and resurrection. So I believe in this as well.
Okay, so now we have some time for a wider discussion. I wanted to ask maybe Gabriella if you could help us take the microphone around. Yeah, so that people can speak into the microphone and we can hear them on the recording. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello?
Yeah, it's
You
working.
can hear me. Thank you very much. I'm Annabelle Ing, Deputy British Ambassador to the Holy See. So very interesting. I have to admit up front, this question of what makes an educational institution Catholic is a question I'm incredibly ill qualified to offer any comment on. Contrary to what you said, Father Alejandro, is that I, as a British diplomat to the Holy See, I never attended a Catholic school or university. But for what it's worth, I thought maybe I could offer a different perspective on this debate, since we're talking about the interaction, the value, the tension even of church, state, and in educational institutions. And I think there is something, from my perspective, since coming here, I've been 2 years here serving at the British Embassy to the Holy See, in terms of what we, the rest of the world, we governments, state, can learn from and be inspired by in terms of Catholic educational institutions I've come across in my work. Admittedly, that is more in the international space, and in particular in our development work. when I look back to where I'm from, which is North London, the Catholic schools around me and the people who went to them, it was a bit more of an elitist, I have to say, conception, similar to what you said, Father. I remember friends that their parents would deliberately go to church and move boroughs in order to get into those schools. But back to my impressions and what I've come across and been really impressed and inspired by, and you can tell me if this is Catholic, but I've come across again and again, especially looking at schooling, for example, in conflict countries, fragile states. Let's take South Sudan as an example, because there you see parts of the country where there is no state infrastructure, there are no state schools, and especially if you're a young girl, and there are so many forces against you getting an education, the very rationale, raison d'etre of some of these institutions and the people that run them is about care and dignity and worth of every human being. And certainly there are values that state education, I would hope, offers that can go some way to meet that, and we can translate and have a dialogue about that. Human rights, diversity, inclusion, social mobility are some words that come to mind. But certainly that's something that in our work at the British Embassy to the Holy See, we take into very high consideration and consider how we can benefit from that exchange, from what the church does in that space that states do not or cannot provide in especially parts of the world like South Sudan. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
If I may just not directly answer to what you say, but this was an experience, especially working also with your government, both in the country, but also here in Rome with your predecessors, with the ambassadors there, and also looking into the former British countries, where we quite often have quite a robust system, which was based on the distinction between two different authorities. So the state authority and the administration, state administration, and the church. And this is something which I experienced working with your embassy and with your government was wonderful. I remember when there was the question of how is COVID influencing education. And the British government has allocated a lot of money and done a lot of research. And then they presented the first draft as a report and invited some people from the church who were familiar with church education, just to confront it with different situations, say, can this be true? Or is this what we find out? And the other thing is, you mentioned also in England the elitist schools, but the grand bulk, the biggest, more than 90% of Catholic schools in England are public schools. Not public, sorry, state schools. State schools. They are funded like all the other state schools.
Yes, sorry, just to respond to that, and I may just be talking about my very local context.
Yeah,
but even if they're public, you get a situation in which people will move to an area and it will become gentrified.
Yeah,
so that they have the opportunity to go there. Sorry, do carry on.
No, and I was this year I was in a Catholic school where they would charge you £2,000 a month tuition. So
yes, there are some schools which are sometimes elitist, but this would not be true throughout England. There are over 2,000 state schools, Catholic state schools in England, and they're the most diverse. They're actually more diverse than the state system in terms of the ethnic groups who are in them. So it's not quite as elitist as you've described in North London. If you're thinking of the Cardinal Vaughan School, the Oratory School, yes. But I'm thinking of lots of other schools that I could take you to in London, which are not like that at all, and are really generating social mobility. They're pushing ahead, and they're doing a fantastic job on both the social side and also, producing people who want to contribute to the common good as well in the future.
And I have to add, this is possible, what he says, because there is this good funding scheme where the Catholic schools get the public money and the taxpayers don't pay twice for education. So thank you. You can communicate this to London, that we are very grateful.
Very interesting talk, Father. I agree very much with what Father said. Just give an example. I won't mention the place where I'm from, but the Catholic University, it's a pontifical university, and their enrollment has been going down. So what they've been trying to do to raise enrollment is they're saying, well, look, you know, what you can get at these other universities that are attracting our Catholic students, a degree in psychology, a degree in engineering, whatever, we can do that too. We have the same things there. So and I think I talk to people in the parishes and I say, you know, your kids, where do they go to school? Where are they going to the university? And they'll say, well, they go to the secular one. And they're very, very good Catholics. Well, why don't they go to the Catholic school, university? And they'll say, well, it's the same as the secular one. There's no difference. They're not getting any Catholic. And I'd rather them go to a secular institution knowing that they're in a hostile environment and they'll, you know, be on the defense rather than go to the Catholic one, lower their guard, and get you know, the same stuff they're going to get. You know, maybe they'll lose their faith. And many do say that their children do lose their faith when they go to a Catholic university. So I just wonder, Father, sometimes what is, I mean, certainly I guess at the local level, the bishop or whoever, conference of bishops, but what has happened that so many of these universities, even Catholic schools that were Catholic, and I think most parents, at least from my experience, they send their kids, why do they sacrifice to spend more money to send their kids to a Catholic school, Catholic university, is they expect a Catholic education, or at least an education that's not going to undermine the Catholic faith. And yet we often don't get that.
Their time is, in a certain sense, working for us. I'm not defending the market forces, but in any case, but it is a phenomenon that parents, students are looking more critically also on the identity of a school. And if they expect something and they don't provide it, they don't enroll in it. And there is some Catholic schools or Catholic universities that have an enormous decline of enrollment, even had to stop their activities because they lost what was or what should be their added value. So I think there is a positive development in our time that people are more critically looking at the schools, and that there is also more transparency. And there is a lot of what we could call transparency tools today. That starts with the websites. I don't like rankings, but there is similar tools like rankings which don't make a league table, but just make more descriptive comparison between institutions. And even if sometimes institutions don't like them, I think this is very good. And actually we introduced with the Holy See, with the agency Ave Pro, also an institution which examines and publish reports. And this was something which we were at the beginning, and I still believe could be something also, not making league tables. I don't like if you then say number one in the league of Catholic identity is, because this is absolutely biased. And no, there is some people who do this, but this is rubbish. That's you cannot look at this because there is no criteria, and that's not really a scientific way how they do it. But the tendency that you look at these elements, that's positive, and that gives me hope, because we are not living anymore in a time, in a society where a central authority can say, okay, now we define how it should be, and then we sometimes when people said, well, are you not doing anything, and you have seen this university and then no more Catholic, and then say, now you have convinced me. I asked my friend who is the chief commander of the Swiss Guard, and we sent 10 of them, and they will solve it, but it's not working like that. But what I had not, I wanted to say this. Pope Benedict argues quite often with this attraction of the good, of the beautiful, and of the true. Not in that the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I think this is what education should be. We cannot impose to the single person that this is the true. This is true, and you have to believe it because I, the teacher, tell you, and the director, and behind me the Pope had said that in the Catholic school we have to tell you that this is true, that this is beautiful, that this is good. But Benedict very often came back to this natural attraction of what is good, what is beautiful, what is true. And that there is this longing in every single person. And if we can do something in education, and especially this would be part of my philosophy of Catholic education, is try to promote this longing and this passion in the young people for what is good, what is true, for what is beautiful, and that they probably also then find out that they're in the last instant longing for God himself. The God who revealed himself as good, as love, as beauty.
I'm Bohumil Patrick, a Vaticanist from ex-Czechoslovakia in Rome. And thank you for, is it on? Do you hear me? Okay. Thank you for a very fascinating debate. I believe this year a bishop in Worcester in USA took away the status of a Catholic school, of one Jesuit school, because it's the rainbow flag. And I use this example as an introduction to my, I believe, simple question. Are there any lobbies, groups, state officials, whatever we call it, or people, bodies that try to impose, I don't know, things, BLM, critical race theory, sexual disorientation, or whatever is against the catechism of the Catholic Church, leading to this confusion or to these schools losing the Catholic status? And are bishops, local bishops or local church authorities willing to fight for the Catholicity?
Yeah, very, very, very good question. I could comment on the specific case because there is also canon law, and canon law provides some possibilities that you handle with such a case. And I think it was not fully lawful what the bishop made, as it was not correct what the school made. So you had to find, and I don't know what the Castro is doing now with the case. But definitely, there is always people who want to, I make it very general, who want to be reality in another way as it is, and they want to have the school different than it is, and they all put pressure, and it's a very complex situation, because you don't have this very clear cut black and white. You have also all the shades of gray, and that means you have to work with reality as it is and take out the best of it in a team play. So it doesn't help if the bishop says, okay, now I withdraw the Catholic adjective from their title, but the problem is that the school does not have it in their title, because they call themselves Ignatius School or whatever, or St. Bernard School or whatever, and the bishop has no legal standing to forbid them to call themselves St. Bernard School or whatever. And even if he would take it formally away in the perception of the people, would it change anything if it's the school of a religious order? No. But it means we have to find other ways to resolve these conflicts. And I think that's what the Pope is about with his synodal approach to the church. That means to understand that we are in the same way, and then we can see what we have in common. Then we see where there are still open questions, and then we can make suggestions and speak about how we can probably reach them. And I think that's nothing else that you can do, because again, we cannot send the Swiss Guard from Rome and say now we make every single non-Catholic school Catholic within the next half year. And even if you would have all the means and all the money and all the personal resources, there is human freedom. And also a Catholic school is run by human persons who have their faith, who have their opinions. And sometimes you can even learn from those who in the first moment say something which you absolutely would not accept. And then you begin to understand that probably behind this there is a good reason why they want to have it. Or at least you can explain why this person is thinking like that. And that changes already a bit the picture. And then you say, okay, let's sit down and see what we can together make out and how this school can in the end be a better Catholic school. But being a better Catholic school doesn't mean that all schools have to apply my sets of standards, which I would like to have for the best Catholic school. Because every single school can be the best Catholic school if it's faithful to its mission, and the mission is very different.
Good evening. Thank you very much to all the speakers for such wonderful presentations. My name is Frances Collins. I'm the Irish ambassador to the Holy See. So you will understand that we have a particular history of Catholic education in Ireland, which was in the context of our state not being able to provide health or education service in the immediate independence era. And that resulted in, obviously, the Catholic institutions, but also some Protestant institutions stepping in and providing what the state could not. For some people, that was a really good experience. I myself was educated by Mercy nuns and incredibly thankful for the education that was given. But for others, it was not, and the state and the church both did not perform very well or did not admit when mistakes were made, and we are still very much dealing with the legacy of that in the present day, which is a challenge. So I think sometimes it's important that we recognize some of those issues, you know, particularly in the Irish context. The other thing I want to say is, at the present time in Ireland, because of the legacy issues and because of the ongoing debate that we have, and I suppose as an over-reliance in terms of the state exporting social service delivery, we're very much looking at the patronage of schools. And it's rather a difficult debate in Ireland, and it is a very difficult issue, I think, for the Catholic bishops as well, because they will often say they have a number of schools in their diocese, both primary and secondary, and they will say we're incredibly, you know, we can't manage all of these schools, not with the manpower we currently have, and we would like to hand over some of these schools to the states. But when they go to hand over the schools to the state, the parents will say, you can take that school and that school, but not my school, because Catholic education is quality education. So it's still a difficult road that we have to travel as church and state, and we're trying to actually navigate that at the moment. But the other thought that I had, and I think it's coming out of the Synod as well, that maybe there needs to be deeper thinking around this whole area. And I was just wondering, I've seen some really innovative programs, particularly at third level, including by the Pontifical Irish College here in Rome, where they have actively implemented this program around the formation of the laity. So does there need to be more work done around getting a balance between education and formation, and is that like an opportunity going forward for the church in multiple countries? Thank you.
Thank you. And I like the Irish example, and you mentioned history, and we look back at Catherine McAuley, for example, and I recently read a biography of her, and she had nothing, and you are wondering how she, during her lifetime, with her own conditions, was able to face such a challenge and give a wonderful answer to her in her times. And then we had in the same country the experience that in times when everything was quite comfortable for the church, we failed. And so it's strange, in moments where you think from the conditions we cannot do anything good, we manage to do good, and in times where all the conditions are there, we are not managing to doing good, or I wouldn't generalize because there's many good schools all the time. And then the question I was discussing once with the school boards association there and we discussed and we said, okay, also we know that we have too many Catholic schools, but exactly what you have said, it is difficult then to say which one. And then there's other schools, because if you close a Catholic school, then people say, what's with the Gael schools? And then there's all these other layers of discussion which you have in the country. And coming to your last point, this is a very important one. Also this ongoing formation for people engaged in education, and I just had this year an experience, wonderful experience. Actually, it was coming from Australia. It's the Catholic University of Australia, La Salle Academy, who developed a program which is called Spiritus Retreat, which is now spread out partly in the Pacific Islands, but then in England, in Scotland, in Ireland as well. And the idea is they found out that we have not enough taken in the students as protagonists of Catholic education. And in the end, working with principals, working with school superintendents, working with teachers, but the program's idea is to break this down and engage the young ones. And I have seen this in some schools. It's fantastic. You don't get that many. It's 10% or so who volunteer to engage themselves in student chaplaincy and other things. But this can really change a school and the school culture. And this in that case, it's based on very good research done by the Catholic University of Australia for many, many years. And they found out that for religious socialization, the testimony of the peers is more important than what the teachers tell them. So they said we have to invest in this, and with all the academic rigor and all their methodology, all their professionality, which they had, they developed a wonderful program. But that the program works has also to do with professionality, but it has to do that there is certain people who are inspired and inspiring others, and that if you bring a certain number of them together, then it gets an energy and something beautiful is developing out of it. In a moment where you think, okay, can we maintain in many countries these big numbers of Catholic schools and have a significant distinguishing identity between our schools and others? But thank you again for your